August 24th, 79 CE. Vesuvius erupts. The city of Pompeii dies in hours, buried under volcanic ash and pumice. Everything stops in an instant. Meals half-eaten on tables, people frozen in their final moments. And in one particular house near the city's amphitheatre, a collection of instruments left exactly where their owner placed them, preserved perfectly under 20 feet of volcanic debris. Archaeologists call it the House of the Surgeon. When they excavated it in the 1800s, they found over 40 surgical instruments. Not crude tools or primitive approximations, refined medical instruments that look disturbingly familiar. Scalpels with blade angles identical to modern surgical scalpels. The edge geometry, the handle design, the balance, all the same. Forceps with the same mechanical principle, the same pivot point, the same gripping surfaces we use today. Bone saws with tooth patterns that modern orthopedic surgeons would recognize instantly. Vaginal speculums that gynecologists still use in effectively the same design. Catheters, bone drills. A specialized probe that appears designed specifically for cataract surgery. Hold a Roman scalpel next to a modern one and you'd struggle to explain the differences. The materials are different. Bronze versus stainless steel. The manufacturing is different. Forged versus precision machined. But the design, the function, the understanding of what makes an effective surgical tool, identical across 2,000 years. This wasn't one physician's unique collection. Similar instruments have been found at Roman sites across the empire. Standardized designs, consistent quality, widespread distribution. This was industrial production of medical equipment, suggesting organized medical education with agreed-upon best practices. The instruments tell us Romans were performing surgery. What they don't tell us is how sophisticated that surgery was. For that, we look at the texts. Specifically, the work of Galen of Pergamon, Rome's most famous physician. Galen performed brain surgery. Not just trepanation, which other ancient cultures did, but deliberate surgical interventions targeting specific conditions. He removed cataracts, restoring sight to the blind. He describes cesarean sections in his texts, including guidance on when the procedure was appropriate and techniques to improve maternal survival. His anatomical knowledge was extraordinary for any era, let alone the 2nd century. He understood that arteries carried blood, not air, disproving theories that had persisted for centuries. He identified 7 of the 12 cranial nerves. He recognized that the brain, not the heart, controlled the body, a concept that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. He understood kidney function, that these organs filtered blood and produced urine. He even grasped that heart valves maintained one-way blood flow, getting remarkably close to understanding circulation 14 centuries before William Harvey. But here's what histories often miss. Galen wasn't a lone genius working in isolation. He was the peak of a medical tradition stretching back centuries. Roman military doctors, treating battlefield injuries, accumulated vast practical knowledge. Greek physicians contributed theoretical frameworks and observational methods. Egyptian medical texts, thousands of years old, informed Roman practice. Galen served as physician to gladiators early in his career. That meant treating traumatic injuries daily. Deep wounds, shattered bones, organs exposed. The human body laid bare. not through careful dissection, but through violence. He learned anatomy from necessity, from seeing what worked and what didn't, from patients who lived and patients who died. When Rome fell, Galen's texts survived. Barely. A few manuscripts, copied and recopied, transmitted through Arabic translations during the Islamic Golden Age, eventually returning to Europe. But the system that created physicians like Galen, that collapsed completely. Medical schools closed. Dissection practices were banned by medieval Christian authorities who considered the body sacred and inviolable. The empirical tradition, learning through observation, testing, refinement, was replaced by scholasticism, where ancient texts were memorized and debated, but rarely tested against reality. The instruments buried in Pompeii represented something larger than tools. They represented an entire medical culture, training systems, knowledge transmission, social acceptance of surgery as legitimate healing rather than butchery. When that culture collapsed, the instruments became artifacts, interesting relics from a civilization that had somehow known things medieval physicians couldn't imagine. But instruments are just tools. What's truly remarkable is what Roman surgeons did with those tools. Procedures that we're told didn't exist until modern medicine. Yet the evidence says otherwise. Cataract surgery sounds modern. The idea of deliberately inserting an instrument into the eye, manipulating the lens, restoring sight. It feels like something from the last century, maybe two. Something requiring microscopes, anesthesia, sterile operating rooms. Romans were doing it 2,000 years ago. The technique was called couching. A needle-like instrument, bronze and precisely shaped, would be inserted through the white of the eye. The surgeon would push the clouded lens downward and out of the visual axis. Not removing it, that came later with more advanced techniques, but displacing it so light could reach the retina again. The patient, who had been living in progressive darkness, could see. Archaeological evidence from Montpellier shows a Roman-era bronze needle designed specifically for this procedure. The tip is carefully calibrated, the shaft rigid enough to manipulate the lens, but not so thick it causes excessive trauma. This wasn't experimental. This was refined, standardized equipment for a routine procedure. Medieval Europe eventually rediscovered couching, but not commonly until the 1700s. 15 centuries between Roman ophthalmology and its re-emergence. 15 centuries of blind people who might have been helped, living in darkness because the knowledge was lost. Trepanation, drilling holes in skulls, appears in multiple ancient cultures, but Roman physicians refined it beyond crude boring. They understood that head injuries could cause bleeding inside the skull, creating pressure that killed patients. Relieving that pressure required accessing the brain, which meant penetrating bone without destroying the delicate tissue beneath. Roman trepanation tools created clean, circular holes, specialized drills with stops to prevent penetrating too deeply, techniques for avoiding major blood vessels. Most remarkably, they understood sterile procedure, boiling instruments before use, using wine as an antiseptic. The alcohol killed bacteria they couldn't see, but had learned empirically caused infection. We know patients survived because we have skulls showing healed trepanation sites. Clean bone regrowth around the margins. indicating the person lived weeks, months, sometimes years after the procedure. This wasn't desperate last resort butchery with predictably fatal results. This was surgery with survival rates that suggest genuine medical competence. Then there's caesarean section. The etymology is disputed. Maybe from Julius Caesar's birth. Maybe from the Latin verb to cut. What's not disputed is that Roman medical texts describe the procedure, when to perform it, how to minimize blood loss, techniques to improve maternal survival, though admittedly survival rates were lower than modern medicine achieves. Medieval European physicians largely abandoned surgical childbirth intervention. Prayer became the primary response to complicated births. When surgical delivery was attempted, it was usually to save the child from a mother already dead or dying. The concept of performing caesarean section to save both mother and child, something Roman texts discuss, was lost. Maternal mortality rates skyrocketed. Complications that Roman physicians might have addressed surgically became death sentences. Women died. Babies died. Families were destroyed by conditions that weren't necessarily fatal, but had become so, because knowledge had been forgotten. Why did these techniques vanish? Surgery requires more than knowing the steps. It requires institutional support. Medical schools where techniques are taught systematically. Libraries preserving texts. Legal and social permission to cut into bodies. Cultural acceptance that surgery is legitimate medicine, not mutilation. The medieval church's position that the body was sacred and shouldn't be violated created enormous barriers. Human dissection was forbidden or severely restricted. Without dissection, anatomy remained abstract. Without understanding anatomy, surgery stayed primitive or was abandoned entirely. Roman medical schools collapsed along with everything else. The formal training system that produced Galen and thousands of less famous physicians ceased to exist. Knowledge reverted to individual healers working in isolation, herbalists, bone setters, midwives. Some possessed genuine skill, but without institutional frameworks to accumulate and transmit complex knowledge, sophisticated techniques couldn't survive. Medieval universities eventually revived medical education, but slowly. And when they did, dissection was rare. Texts were memorized but not tested. Galen's works were treated as infallible scripture rather than as methodology to emulate. Students learned what Galen said, not how Galen learned. So techniques that had been routine in Roman practice became lost arts. Procedures that had saved lives for centuries were forgotten. The instruments existed. Archaeologists kept finding them. But the knowledge of what to do with them, the surgical skill, the institutional training, the cultural permission, all gone. Medieval Europe called these procedures impossible or branded them as witchcraft. Not because they actually were impossible, but because the knowledge to perform them had died. And with it died countless people who might have been saved. Surgical skill was impressive, but it's what Roman physicians understood about the human body itself that seems truly impossible for their time. Some of their anatomical knowledge wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, and some of it still puzzles medical historians today. Galen understood circulation, not completely, William Harvey wouldn't figure out the full circulatory system until 1628, 14 centuries later. But Galen knew that arteries and veins were separate systems. He recognized that blood flowed, that it moved through the body in organized patterns. He understood that heart valves maintained one-way flow, preventing backflow. He was remarkably close to grasping the complete picture. He knew nerves transmitted signals from the brain, not electrical impulses. That concept waited another 1600 years. But he understood the brain controlled the body, that damage to specific nerves caused specific losses of function. He'd mapped 7 of the 12 cranial nerves, documenting which controlled which facial movements, which carried sensation from which areas. He understood kidney function, that these organs filtered blood, concentrating waste into urine. Not the detailed mechanism of nephron filtration, but the functional principle. Blood goes in, cleaned blood comes out, waste is eliminated. This shouldn't have been possible. Human anatomy is hidden inside bodies. You can't see it functioning. Studying it requires dissection, systematic exploration, careful documentation. Galen had all 3. He'd served as physician to gladiators in Pergamon, battlefield medicine before battlefields were called that. Men with their bodies torn open, organs visible, bones shattered. Every injury was an anatomy lesson. Which wounds were fatal, which survivable. What each organ did became apparent when damage to it killed or crippled. Knowledge earned through tragedy, but knowledge nonetheless. He performed public dissections, usually animals, sometimes human cadavers when available. He demonstrated anatomy to students and colleagues, showing structures, explaining functions, testing theories. Cut this nerve, and the arm goes limp. Damage this part of the brain and speech fails. Empirical observation, methodical documentation. He was part of a tradition valuing evidence over philosophy. Greek medicine had spent centuries debating what the body must be like based on logic and theory. Galen's approach was different. Cut open and look. See what's actually there. Test your ideas against reality. When Rome fell, his texts survived, partially, copied by hand in monasteries, translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, eventually retranslated back into Latin. We have much of Galen's work. What we lost was the methodology, the tradition, the institutional framework that created physicians like him. Medieval European scholars treated Galen as infallible authority. They memorized his conclusions. Arteries carry blood. Nerves transmit signals. Kidneys filter. But they didn't emulate his process. They didn't dissect and observe and question. Galen said it. Therefore it was true. No need to verify. When medical schools gradually revived in medieval universities, dissection was rare and heavily restricted. Maybe 1 dissection per year, performed ceremonially, with a professor reading Galen's texts while a barber surgeon did the cutting. Students barely saw the body, never touched it, learned anatomy from books rather than observation. Andreas Vesalius in the 1540s is celebrated for correcting some of Galen's errors, showing that human anatomy differed in some ways from the animal anatomy Galen had studied. But read Vesalius carefully, and you realize he wasn't just correcting mistakes. He was rediscovering method, dissection as learning tool. observation as authority, testing classical texts against physical reality. We estimate Roman anatomical understanding, at least Galen's understanding, was roughly equivalent to 16th or 17th century European knowledge. Europe lost somewhere between 1200 and 1400 years of medical progress, more than a millennium during which physicians knew less about the human body than Galen had in the 2nd century. The human cost defies calculation. How many died from conditions Romans could have diagnosed? How many suffered complications that Roman anatomical knowledge might have prevented? How many surgical interventions failed because medieval physicians didn't understand what they were cutting through? Millions. Conservative estimates say millions of preventable deaths over those lost centuries. And some texts didn't survive at all. We have references to works that are gone completely. Galen mentions other physicians, other texts, other discoveries. Those are lost. We don't even know what we don't know. What knowledge disappeared so thoroughly that not even references remain? A Roman physician in 200 CE understood circulation, nerve function, kidney filtration. European doctors in 1400 CE still thought blood was made in the liver and consumed by tissues. They'd regressed. Knowledge had actually moved backward. Medicine wasn't the only field where Roman theoretical understanding seems impossibly advanced. When we look at their astronomy and mathematics, we find calculations and concepts that wouldn't resurface in Europe for over 1,000 years, and some that still raise questions today. There's a puzzle at the heart of Roman engineering that nobody likes to discuss. The Pantheon's dome required calculating volumes, weights, structural loads distributed across a curved surface. Aqueduct surveys spanning hundreds of kilometers needed trigonometry and understanding of Earth's curvature. Distributing grain rations to 1 million people demanded accurate accounting and logistics planning. All of this required mathematics. Sophisticated mathematics. The kind that makes modern engineers reach for calculators. Romans used numerals that make basic arithmetic a nightmare. Try multiplying XLIV by XU3 using Roman numerals. Just try. You can't do it efficiently. The system isn't designed for calculation. It's designed for recording results. Addition is tedious. Multiplication is nearly impossible. Division and fractions become absurd. Yet somehow Romans built structures that required precise mathematical modeling. They surveyed routes that needed geometric solutions we'd use calculus to solve. They managed logistics that demanded computational power their numeric system couldn't provide. The answer is, they didn't calculate the way we do. They used different tools, different methods, different mathematical thinking entirely. For accounting and basic arithmetic, they used the abacus. Not the children's toy version, but sophisticated counting boards with beads or stones representing different values. A skilled abacus user could add, subtract, multiply, and divide faster than someone working with written Roman numerals. The calculation happened physically, with the hands, the results recorded afterward. No written arithmetic required. For structural engineering, they used physical models and proportional scaling. Build a small version, test it, scale up the proportions. Greek mathematical texts provided theoretical backing, but Roman engineers worked empirically. They understood that doubling dimensions didn't just double strength, It changed everything about how structures behaved. They learned this through observation and testing, not through abstract equations. For surveying, they had instruments that solved problems mechanically. The Groma established perfect right angles through hanging weights and sightlines. The Corobots leveled across long distances using water channels. These weren't measurement tools requiring calculation afterward. They were mathematical solutions embodied in physical form. The instrument did the geometry. The engineer just had to use it correctly. This represents fundamentally different mathematical thinking, not abstract and symbolic, but practical, visual, tactile. The mathematics was embedded in tools, techniques, traditional proportions. Knowledge passed through demonstration rather than textbooks. Understanding that lived in hands and eyes rather than written formulas. When Roman civilization collapsed, this practical mathematical culture vanished. Medieval Europe retained some theoretical mathematics through translated Greek texts, Euclid's geometry, basic arithmetic principles. But the engineering mathematics, the applied knowledge that let Romans build impossibly ambitious structures, that died with the civilization that created it. Gothic cathedral architects spent generations rediscovering structural principles through trial and error. Towers collapsed, vaults cracked. Entire projects failed because the builders were working without the accumulated engineering knowledge Romans had possessed. What Romans knew intuitively from training and tradition, medieval builders had to relearn through expensive, sometimes deadly experimentation. The Colosseum was built in under 8 years. A massive, complex structure with sophisticated crowd management, underground machinery, precise structural calculations. 8 years from start to completion. Medieval cathedrals took centuries. Notre Dame took nearly 200 years. Cologne Cathedral took over 600 years. The difference wasn't just ambition or resources, it was knowledge. Romans possessed engineering mathematics that let them work efficiently, confidently. Medieval builders were feeling their way forward in darkness, rediscovering principles that had once been standard practice. Some evidence of Roman mathematical sophistication survives. Surveying manuals contain geometric solutions, showing they understood concepts we'd later formalize algebraically. Architecture displays proportional relationships and load calculations that imply sophisticated modeling. The Antikythera mechanism, technically Greek but within Roman cultural sphere, proves they could design gear systems encoding complex astronomical ratios. But these are fragments. The comprehensive mathematical education that produced engineers capable of building the Pantheon, that training system and knowledge tradition, is gone. We have the monuments. We can measure them, analyze them, reverse engineer their principles. What we can't fully recover is the mathematical thinking that created them, that fundamentally different approach to calculation and problem solving that worked without the symbolic mathematics we consider essential. The structures themselves are mathematical treatises, written in stone and concrete rather than symbols. We can read them, but we're reading a language we only partially understand. From a mathematical culture that approached numbers differently than we do. Mathematics was just one area where Roman theoretical knowledge exceeded what we'd expect. When we look at their understanding of astronomy, the movements of planets, the calculation of eclipses, the size of the Earth, we find knowledge that makes us question what else they knew. Eratosthenes stood in Alexandria and watched shadows. Specifically, he watched the shadow cast by a vertical stick at precisely noon on the summer solstice. The shadow was short, but measurable. He noted the angle, about 7 degrees from vertical. On the same day, at the same time, 5,000 stadia to the south in Siena, no shadow appeared. The sun was directly overhead, its light falling straight down wells. Vertical objects casting no shadow at all. 2 cities, 2 shadows. One simple observation. From this, Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference. His result was within 2% of the actual value. In the 3rd century BCE, using only shadows and geometry. The calculation required understanding several things. First, that Earth was spherical, not flat. Second, that the sun was far enough away that its rays arrived essentially parallel. Third, basic geometry relating angles to arc length. He had all 3. He treated Earth as a sphere, the distance between cities as an arc along that sphere, and the shadow angle as proportional to the total circumference. It worked. Brilliantly. And this knowledge wasn't obscure or secret. Educated Romans knew Earth was round. They knew its approximate size. They understood the geometric principles. This was standard intellectual currency in the Roman world. Medieval Europe forgot, or disputed, or simply didn't care. Flat Earth beliefs resurged, not universally. Some scholars maintained the truth, but the knowledge became controversial rather than settled fact. It took navigators in the age of exploration, sailing around continents and coming back where they started, to empirically confirm what Romans had known mathematically 15 centuries earlier. Hipparchus created a star catalogue with over 850 stars, each positioned precisely. More remarkably, he discovered axial precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. Detecting this required comparing observations separated by generations, recognizing that star positions had shifted slightly over centuries. This wasn't just astronomical observation. This was detecting a phenomenon so gradual that no single human lifetime could observe it directly. Ptolemy's Almagest, written in Roman Egypt, provided mathematical models of planetary motion, accurate enough to predict eclipses years in advance. The calculations were complex. Epicycles and deferents, geometric constructions that approximated planetary paths. Wrong theory, ultimately, but producing correct predictions. Navigation used these tables. Agricultural calendars depended on them. Rome's calendar itself demonstrated astronomical sophistication. Julius Caesar reformed the calendar with help from Egyptian astronomers, creating the Julian calendar in 46 BCE. It assumed a year of 365.25 days, requiring 1 leap year every 4 years. This was accurate enough to remain Rome's standard calendar, and after Rome fell, Europe's standard until 1582. 16 centuries of use with only minor correction needed. The Gregorian calendar we use today is just the Julian calendar with a small adjustment, skipping 3 leap years every 400 years to account for the year being slightly shorter than 365.25 days. But beyond practical astronomy, there was theoretical speculation that sounds shockingly modern. Aristarchus of Samos, 3rd century BCE, proposed heliocentrism. The sun at the center, Earth and planets orbiting it. This was 18 centuries before Copernicus. The model was rejected. Ptolemy's geocentric system made better predictions with available observations. But the point is, someone conceived it. Someone looked at the cosmos and thought, what if we're not at the center? This knowledge required infrastructure, observatories for systematic observation, libraries preserving data across generations, mathematical training to model celestial mechanics, institutional continuity supporting long-term projects. When Roman educational infrastructure collapsed, sophisticated astronomy largely vanished from Western Europe. It survived elsewhere. The Islamic Golden Age preserved Roman and Greek astronomical knowledge, improved on it, developed new instruments and techniques. Islamic astronomers kept the tradition alive, while European astronomy regressed to basic calendrical calculations and astrological speculation. Europe eventually recovered this knowledge through Arabic texts, translated in the 12th and 13th centuries, but that represented centuries of lost progress. Time when European astronomy was less sophisticated than what Romans had practiced 1,000 years earlier. The pattern repeats. Knowledge accumulated over centuries, preserved through institutions, requiring continuous cultivation and transmission. When institutions collapse, knowledge scatters. Some survives in texts, some survives in other cultures. Much simply dies, waiting to be painstakingly rediscovered. Romans knew Earth was round. They'd calculated its size accurately. They'd mapped the stars precisely. Some had even proposed heliocentrism. Medieval Europe forgot all three, or disputed them, or lost the mathematical sophistication to engage with them meaningfully. Astronomical calculations required instruments, tools for measuring angles, tracking time, recording observations. Some of those instruments are so sophisticated they've been called ancient computers. And the most famous one still doesn't make sense. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera found a shipwreck. Roman era, maybe 1st century BCE. Bronze statues, pottery, the usual archaeological treasures. And one corroded lump that nobody understood. It sat in storage for decades. Just a mass of calcified bronze, vaguely mechanical looking, but unimpressive. Then someone X-rayed it. The images showed gears, dozens of gears, interlocking, carefully sized, precisely positioned. This wasn't decoration. This was a machine. Further analysis revealed at least 30 bronze gears arranged in a sophisticated mechanism. The gear teeth are triangular, interlocking smoothly. The ratios between gears encode specific mathematical relationships. One gear ratio is 254 to 19, which happens to approximate the relationship between solar years and lunar months with remarkable accuracy. Modern reconstructions, built using the original as template, demonstrate what this machine did. It calculated astronomical positions. Turn a crank and the gears rotate, showing the sun's position through the zodiac, the moon's phase and position, the positions of the 5 planets known to ancient astronomers. It predicted eclipses using the Saros cycle, a 223-month period, after which eclipse patterns repeat. It was, functionally, an analog computer for astronomy. The engineering shouldn't be possible. Creating gears this precise required sophisticated metalworking, lathes or similar tools capable of cutting uniform teeth. Understanding how to calculate gear ratios to produce desired outputs requires mathematical sophistication. The device as a whole demonstrates knowledge of mechanics and astronomy that seems impossibly advanced. It dates to around 100 BCE, 1st century before Christ, and we see nothing like it anywhere else in the ancient world. No known predecessors showing simpler versions being developed and refined. No known successors carrying the technology forward. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone, technologically isolated. The next devices with comparable complexity are Islamic astronomical clocks from the medieval period and European mechanical clocks from the 14th century. That's a gap of 1400 years. 14 centuries where nothing remotely similar appears in the archaeological or historical record. Several theories attempt to explain this. Maybe it was a unique masterpiece by a genius inventor, one-of-a-kind brilliance that died with its creator. Possible, but the sophistication suggests institutional knowledge, not solitary genius. Building this required skills in metalworking, astronomy, mathematics, mechanics. That's collaborative work, not one person laboring in isolation. Maybe there was a broader tradition of gear-based mechanisms that didn't survive. Bronze was valuable. When devices broke or became obsolete, they'd be melted down for the metal. We might be seeing the single lucky survivor from a whole category of machines that were all recycled for their material value. The Antikythera mechanism only survived because it was shipwrecked and buried, protected from salvage. Recent scholarship suggests it might have been built on roads, possibly by followers of Hipparchus, the astronomer who catalogued stars and discovered axial precession. That would explain the astronomical sophistication and implies an institutional tradition, a school, essentially, producing astronomical instruments. But if such a tradition existed, why no mentions in surviving texts? Greek and Roman writers documented all sorts of technological marvels: automated theatres, pneumatic devices, water organs. Why no descriptions of these astronomical computers? Why no instruction manuals? No theoretical treatises? No casual references? The silence is as mysterious as the device itself. Either it was so rare and restricted that nobody wrote about it, or those writings were lost, or it was more common but considered too mundane to document, or some other explanation we haven't considered. Modern scientists have studied the Antikythera mechanism extensively. X-rays, CT scans, detailed reconstructions. We understand what it does. We can build working replicas. What we don't fully understand is how it fits into ancient technological development. What came before it? What came after? Was this the peak of a long tradition or a strange aberration? It represents ancient technological capability reaching levels we associate with much later periods. Proof that the ancient world could achieve sophistication we've systematically underestimated. Every assumption about what they could or couldn't do requires recalibration when confronted with 30 bronze gears calculating eclipses 2,000 years ago. The Antikythera mechanism shows that ancient technology could reach levels we associate with much later periods. But perhaps the most unsettling lost technology isn't what Romans created. It's what they destroyed. Specifically, a weapon so terrifying it was used only in desperate moments, and then deliberately forgotten.